Okay, so I just mentioned about Social Security. I'm 62. And during my lifetime, believe it or not, and I'm not saying I'm an expert at this, but I've witnessed this. Over my lifetime, I've witnessed what I consider a very disturbing trend in parenthood. All right? And the seeds of this trend were planted back in the late 60s and early 70s when the hippie generation had rebelled against their parents' values and beliefs. And then they started becoming parents themselves. And a lot of them, what they'd say is, I don't want to be the parent like my parent was because they forced me to go to church. They forced me to do this, that, and the other thing. And those of us who were alive can remember that was a very tumultuous time. But basically, it was a dislike of parents trying to impress their values and religious beliefs onto their children. So hippie parents, particularly those had never been involved with the Jesus movement at that time, felt that their children should be able to find their own way, their own values, and their own religion. And as time went on, this seeped into the church as well, because members of the church were starting to raise their own kids with a similar philosophy. Now, out of 30 years, 20 of them I taught middle school, okay? And in middle school, I watched this transformation take place. I taught not only in the public schools, I was the junior high teacher in my church. And you would see parents taking their kids when they were young to VBS. They go to church every Sunday. Sometimes I wouldn't come on Wednesday, but they would come on Wednesday in the summertime because Wednesday night, it's a school night. They want to make sure they get to school. And then you find out that family never discussed why there was important to have a relationship with Christ. Basically, yeah, we're going to church. Why? That's what we do on Sunday. Okay? And kids, they had fun. They learned the gospel because they heard, if they had good Sunday school teachers, they heard the gospel. And the parents apparently had this thought that, well, it'll soak into the kids through Sunday school. They'll get it by osmosis. And this is not lukewarm parents. These are parents that actually had a true relationship with Christ. But they didn't realize that they were not confronting what they were being their kids were being taught in the public schools about religion. In essence, religion was a matter of opinion. Now, this is interesting. I mean, I taught science, but it's always fascinating that the religious curriculum in social studies in the state of California for sixth grade, if you look at the Christianity unit, it is a preaching of the gospel. You think in California? Oh yeah. And you would read it. It's like, this is the gospel message. This is everything, that Christ died for your sins, that he died and rose again, and it went through and told basically in one paragraph. It'd make a great track. And this was supposed to be taught in the schools. Now, granted, let's talk about Islam. Let's talk about Buddhism. Let's talk about Hinduism. Let's talk about all of this. But you still had the gospel message. But as I mentioned, it was taught as this is a matter of opinion. And to be terribly honest, a lot of social studies teachers would not touch the Christian unit with a 10-foot pole because they didn't want parents screaming, "You're teaching religion in my class." Well, yeah, we are, but not as a religious thing. But yeah, you can teach Buddhism. That's okay. You can teach Hinduism. That's fine. Oh, don't you dare teach Christianity. That was the mindset. And basically the teachers would back off. And so even then they wouldn't hear the gospel message. But here was a really weird thing. As soon as these kids turned 13, suddenly it was hands off. Oh, they're teenagers now. Oh, that's horrible. We can't do anything about that. And what happened? The kids stopped going to school. Well, they're 13. They can make up their own mind. That's not what Proverbs says. You're to raise up a child in the way they should go. That's a parent. That's part of your job. And according to the statistics, 3/4 of the children who were raised in the church left it completely by the time they were 2 years out of graduation, from high school graduation. Obviously, they didn't learn very much. And you have these godly parents that are wringing their hands in despair. wondering what went wrong. And then others watched their children choose their way into destructive lifestyles, and they seemed unconcerned about the eternal destiny of the souls that they were responsible for. I have cousins who are like this. They'll find their own way. Oh, they're going into this lifestyle? That's okay. It's their way. And yet they will, go to church on Easter. Okay? They will say that they believe in Jesus, but they don't live it. And it's just like, guess what, guys? You're going to have to answer to God for that failure. Well, that's harsh, Pastor. No, it's truth. We are responsible for our kids. Now, some of us are parents already. Some were parents or have adult children. Some may not be parents just yet. But whatever the case, it is a responsibility. And we've talked about this before. Right is right, wrong is wrong. God was the one who set up the standards, and he set us up as parents to teach those standards to our children. Okay? And if we are spared, to our grandchildren. Okay? Not only are we to teach them what it means to be a Christian, we have to live the lifestyle that shows that we actually believe what we teach. And in one study, this was a fascinating study I looked up when I was researching for this. Before, by the time this is just typical child, graduates from high school, here's the statistics, more statistics. They will have spent 11,000 hours in school. Okay? 2,000 hours with their parents, 800 hours in church, and that's assuming they attend church regularly, and 63,000 hours consuming the internet, computer games, secular books, TV, movies, music, whatever. Okay? And because the culture does not teach what is right in the eyes of God, we actually have an uphill battle when we are fighting for our kid's soul, and we shouldn't just let it slide for no reason. Okay? It is our job. And that's one of the things. Well, the church will teach it. No, look at the statistics. They're only in for 800 hours. Everything, and they got 2,000 with you. Everything else, no, it doesn't work that way. They're going to hear it from every place else. So if you have your Bibles with you, go ahead and turn back into Genesis. We're starting in chapter 39 today, and we'll be starting in verse 1. Last week, we saw the result of Jacob's failure to be a proper godly father to all of his children. Looking back, remember, he had 2 wives. Well, 2 wives and 2 concubines. He had 12 children, and he blatantly played favorites. Okay? As far as he was concerned, his first wife, Leah, none of their children, those children, even though they were his, none of them really counted. It was Joseph, the son of his favorite wife, Rachel. And my guess is he taught him a lot. And as we're going to see today, oh boy, did he teach him a lot. And he taught him the right way. But last week we saw Judah, another son. But this was the son of Leah. So he struck out on his own. And we mentioned there's a lot of parallels here. He goes out, he gets away from his family. He's hanging around with friends. He spies a beautiful Canaanite girl, a pagan girl, and marries her. Hey, that's okay. No one taught me otherwise. He raised up 3 children. 2 of them we know were bad, were evil, so evil that God had to kill them. Okay, we don't know anything about the 3rd. But in the meantime, because he refused to follow custom and a Levirate law concerning his daughter-in-law, not giving his 3rd son to him as he was supposed to, he decides he wants to, play around with a prostitute. So what does he do? He sees who he thinks is a prostitute, who's actually his daughter-in-law, manages to impregnate her, and he brought humiliation upon himself. Because Judah had found his own way and had discovered that, oh boy, he was wrong. He was in trouble. And we'll see Judah later. You will see that he had a change of heart, but we'll deal with that in due time. In the meantime, in a similar situation, though the details are quite different, Judah had a younger half-brother named Joseph who had been sold into slavery. In fact, it was Judah's idea to do that. And now he was immersed completely in a pagan society, in Egypt. Now, because, and here's the contrast, because he had been Jacob's favorite, he had been given a godly education and he knew right from wrong. And this is going to pay dividends eventually for Joseph, but it was still going to be a hard road ahead. So let's take a look at the first part of this road. We're going to look at Joseph's life as a slave in Egypt. Genesis 39, starting in verse 1. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he was a successful man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all he did to prosper in his hand. So Joseph found favor in his sight and served him. Then he made him overseer of his house, and all that he had he put under his authority. So it was from the time that he had made him overseer of his house and all that he had that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in the house and in the field. Thus he left all that he had in Joseph's hand, and he did not know what he had except for the bread he ate. Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. Now let's stop there. Okay? So we pick up the story. It was mentioned actually back in chapter 37 that Joseph was sold to Potiphar. So now it's repeated. Joseph was purchased by an Egyptian. The name of Potiphar was the captain of the guard for Pharaoh. He was a very high official, likely the chief of the bodyguard for the Pharaoh, and also likely his chief enforcer. He had authority to put people in the king's prisons if necessary. So we see the first parallel here between Joseph and Judah. Both were living among pagans. Okay? Now, granted, Judah went there willingly, but Joseph did not. But they were still pagans. And we see this first contrast between the two brothers. The Lord was with Joseph, but not with Judah. And this is a very important distinction, as we are going to see. Now, to understand Egypt, what's going on, we have to understand Egypt a little bit better. Now, at this moment, sponge from your mind images from the movie The Ten Commandments. Okay? That was later. Okay? Egypt at the time of Joseph, this was This is an era that was referred to as the Middle Kingdom. Can't see the map too well, but it gives you a general idea. Okay? And then I have my phaser here. Okay? So here's Egypt. Okay? And this is Canaan. This is where Joseph came from. Hebron, this is where they lived, okay? Now, at this point in time, Egypt was mostly small villages inhabited by peasants who worked the land and raised grain and vegetables. It was an agricultural society. Now, every year, the Nile River would flood, and it was like clockwork. It was not, oh, it's flooding. What happened? No, in fact, they knew when it was going to happen. They didn't have computers or weather forecasters or anything like this. In the morning, they would see Sirius the dog star rising before the sun. There's a reason why they call that the dog star, the dog days of summer, as they called it. They knew once they saw that thing rising that the flooding was going to happen very soon. So everyone who lived in that area evacuated out of there. And the government provided shelter for them because they knew you take care of your people, and then the floods would come, and the floods would bring nutrients down from the upper Nile from way farther south, and it would flood the area, basically recharge the soil with nutrients that would cause the soil to be extremely fertile. And then once the flood was gone and the mud kind of hardened up, everybody went back, started planting in the fields, and Egypt was a bread basket for the world at that point. So, and they had other ways of using irrigation to make sure there was actual ample water. And this, it was a blessed place. Now, there were some cities, okay? You had a city called On. That's the name, O-N. The Greeks call it Hierapolis, where their sun god Ra was honored. And then there was another city named Memphis that was devoted to Apis, the sacred bull. But these cities, there were quite a few, but most everybody lived in the villages. Now, if you have cities, that means somebody had to build them, and the Egyptians were the builders. Yeah, they did use slaves, because a lot of people think, again, go back to the Ten Commandments. Oh, yeah, the Israelites, hard bondage, helping Charlton Heston build this huge pylon or stuff like that. At this era, yeah, there were slaves that were used, but most of the people who built the pyramids and built the monuments at this point were actually citizens who were paying their income tax. See, they didn't have income tax as we know it today. You had to work for the government for a specified period of time. They would feed you, they would house you. You wouldn't get paid for it, but your payment was your taxes. So these guys, this is free labor. So they would go out and they willingly built these things. Yeah, they had slaves to help out, mostly slaves who were very skilled. All right? Now, while most of the people lived in mud brick houses, the more important structures were constructed of stone. The nobility, their houses were constructed of stone. The temples, some of the pyramids that they had, which were actually tombs, they contained stones that weighed as much as 15 tons. That's why I remember back growing up, everyone said, oh, the Egyptians used UFOs to levitate the stones so they could build the pyramids. No, that's not what happened, sorry, but another story for another time. Their government was a very efficient bureaucracy. Wow, efficient bureaucracy? That's weird. Yes, it was, but it worked. They had many officials at various levels and thousands of scribes for record keeping. Okay, everything was recorded. And then they would be tucked away in an archive place somewhere. Now, there's a lot of debate among scholars which dynasty ruled Egypt when Joseph had arrived. But most seem to think it was toward the end of a period called the Middle Kingdom, but before a period known as the Second Intermediate Period. If you're a historian, that probably means more to you. But this period was a time of instability, okay? Went from a relatively stable area to instability. Why? Well, there were frequent famines, which we're going to see about next week, not right now. And there was a lot of discussion of who actually was in charge of Egypt. As you can see, Egypt is actually split into two. You have Lower Egypt right here at the Delta on the Mediterranean, and you had Upper Egypt that was way up here. Okay, this was a highland area, and the pharaoh was supposed to be as they say, the king of both Egypts. They were unified, but toward the end of the 12th dynasty, there was a pretender to the throne that set up here in, here in Thebes, down here. And then there was the other one that set up here in Memphis. That was their capital. This was long before Cairo was a thing. And there was fighting. There's a lot of bickering. Okay, and you're going to see how this fits in to the biblical account, all right, very soon. So, because of the famines, there was also an influx of immigrants from Canaan. And at the time, up here in Canaan, this area was very loosely controlled by Egypt. Not so much because of conquest, but as a trading area. They could, if they controlled the trade routes up in this area, they could go further afield without having any issues. The conquest, the aggressive conquest of Egypt don't happen until a little bit later. Now, they were religious. The Egyptian priests and wise men studied the heavens and the earth. I mentioned they knew when the Nile was going to flood just by looking at where the stars were rising before the sun. And they actually developed a solar calendar of 365 and 1/4 days, close to what we have. Up to that point, and still in Babylon, it was 360 days. But the Egyptians realized, no, there's some time in here. And they were also, their science was advanced, and they were known for a lot of medicines, a lot of cures for different ailments. Considering the average lifespan was 30 years, I don't think many of these medicines really all that effective, but they were famous for it. Now, I mentioned they were not a aggressive nation at this time. The pharaohs did keep well-trained standing armies. And this formed the basis for larger forces that were raised for defense against invasions. Okay, and again, these were people who were conscripted into the military to help boost up the military in case there was a threat of invasion. Now, their military strategy was defensive. Yeah, they went up into Canaan, as I mentioned, but they were there they didn't really have military outposts up there. They were there because, hey, we want to trade with everybody, and they wanted to go further into Mesopotamia. It is interesting to note that around 1700 BC, which is the beginning of that second intermediate period, there were Canaanites that invaded Egypt. Okay, they overthrew the dynasty in power and established their own control of the country, and these were known as the Hyksos, or shepherd kings. And I mention this because they introduced a weapon into Egypt that the Egyptians would later adapt and use to devastating effect: the horse-drawn chariot. But the Ten Commandments, that Ten Commandments is 500 years later. It was the Canaanites who brought the chariots in. And then the Egyptians say, hey, that's a good idea. And when they regained control, they perfected it. Okay? And the chariots, the horse-drawn chariots, they were essentially the tanks of the ancient world. Okay? If you had chariots and your enemy didn't, you pretty much won the battle. Speaking of religion, it was a polytheistic society, and it controlled every level of society. The religion recognized at least 2,000 gods and goddesses, including the Pharaoh himself. He was considered a god. And there was a lot of emphasis in preparing for the afterlife. A very important god was Osiris, who would judge one's deeds when they died. And it's interesting how, really be honest, Egypt was almost obsessed with death as much as it was devoted to life. And this is demonstrated because the Egyptians had great skill in embalming their dead and preserving the bodies, to the point that thousands of years later, these mummies that the Egyptologists would study, you could tell what disease killed the person. Okay? Or you could find out, this person had an injury. Or this person, they could even tell that, this person was physically disabled, which happened quite a bit. But again, another tale for another time. But they basically didn't really decompose; they just dried up. Okay, and so years later, you'd find a perfectly good mummy there that still had, maybe didn't look real, or look like a real person, I should say, a living person, but you could tell, hey, this is a person. So this was the world that Joseph was a part of, okay? Because he was not Egyptian, okay, he was Hebrew. Because he was not Egyptian, he would receive an Egyptian name from his master, but it wouldn't be a complete name change. Usually it was just the Egyptian transliteration of the slave's native name, okay? For example, when I say that, John in English is Johann in German, or Juan in Spanish, or Jacques in French. They're the same name, they're just translated differently. And the Bible doesn't tell us what Joseph's new name was. He just continues to call him Joseph, so it's probably was the same name. Now, slaves from Canaan and other Semitic areas were quite common in Egypt at the time, so Joseph was in good company. He had plenty of assistance in learning Egyptian, the Egyptian language, both spoken and written, and he was expected to know both. So the Egyptians did train their slaves, especially those who were going to be doing special things, like Joseph was basically an administrator at some point. He had to know how to write. He had to know how to speak the language. And the passage we just read, 5 verses, it really doesn't say much about what's going on. It just gives us the basic details. But we know that Joseph started at the bottom of the pecking order among the slaves. He's the new guy on the block, so he was probably working out in the fields at first. All right? But because God was with him, Joseph began to show himself as a responsible and trustworthy man, and possibly as an organizer. And we don't really know how long this took. But at some point, Potiphar brought him in from the fields to work in the big house, possibly as a houseboy, and later as a valet. Now, a valet is just a fancy name for a personal servant. Okay? Essentially, he followed him around, and he would give Joseph orders, and Joseph would go and do what he was supposed to do. But as time went on, Joseph proved himself trustworthy enough to be placed in charge as what they would call the steward of the house, essentially in charge of the entire operation of the household. Okay, a manager, chief servant, if you will. Really, there's no direct English translation, but basically this guy was number 2 in the house, even though he's a slave. All right? Potiphar trusted everything that he owned into Joseph's care, recognizing that this Hebrew man was gifted by his God. They were religious enough to realize, oh, you worship a different God, but boy, your God does things for you. I mean, he was being a living witness. And Potiphar said, man, I'm glad I got this guy. He's a really valuable addition to the household. And over the years, the two definitely developed an excellent working relationship, clearly built on mutual respect. And a lot of it was the view the Egyptians had of slaves. They were not looked down upon like you would see later in Egyptian history or even in later cultures. Most of the slaves were slaves because they wanted to be so, usually because they owed a debt to somebody. Okay, you owe me, 6,000 papyruses or whatever their monetary system was. Okay, you'll work for me for 6 years. Okay, so they become a slave for 6 years. They still were, compared to later, they're still very well treated and actually had a lot of rights and obligations. We'll talk about that more a little bit later. But definitely, Potiphar implicitly trusted Joseph, and I think we can honestly say Joseph was the model servant. And he was probably held up as an example to the rest in the household. Now, again, we don't know how long this rise among the ranks took, but as many years. It just didn't happen overnight. I remember when I was in, elementary school, at a Christian school, they tend to make it sound like as soon as Potiphar bought him, okay, he's 17, now he's the head of the house. Didn't work that way. Okay, this takes time. And I'm sure Joseph's outlook on life during these years, it changed radically. I mean, consider when he was sold as a slave, he was dad's pampered favorite. Yeah, but now he's a slave far from home, and he's got some pretty heavy responsibilities. All right? Now remember, Jacob was grooming Joseph to be the firstborn, even though he wasn't, the head of the family when Jacob died. And so Joseph was going to have to learn those same responsibilities at some point. But being pampered and being the way it was, he probably wasn't going to learn it at home. Oh, maybe that's why God let him go to Egypt. Very likely. Because he was learning, first off, he learned a very important lesson. Okay? First off, if you want to lead, you have to learn to serve. Okay? And so there was no more sounding off about his dreams. He didn't sit there and say, hey, Potiphar, you're going to bow to me because I had this dream and da-da-da. No more dreams of that. I didn't know if he had dreams, but he didn't sit there and sound off about them. And he learned to keep his mouth shut. Okay? You just don't talk back to your master. And as I said, he probably was the model servant. Yes, sir. No, sir. Never do it again, sir. That type of thing. And God rewarded him because he was learning to serve. And Potiphar just gave him more responsibilities. And that's the way sometimes as a believer, the more you trust in God, the more you do in his service, the more responsibility he gives. I'm a senior pastor here, but I wasn't always that. I started out as some guy working on a computer doing media, basically what Robbie's job was. Okay? And I didn't it took years for me to get to the point where God had raised me up to the point just to be an assistant pastor. Okay? Took a long time. God rewards that type of responsibility. So Joseph, obviously, he recognized that God was watching over him during this time, and he always remained faithful to him, as well as humble and obedient to his master. Now, the last passage here in the last text, the text also mentions that Joseph had grown into a handsome man. Though exactly what that entailed, we don't know, because we really don't know what the Egyptian standard of male beauty was at that time. Okay, well, he was, because he worked a lot, he was probably ripped. Well, we don't know if that was actually a desirable trait. A lot of times in noble houses, looking like you're a strong worker was actually a negative thing, because it indicated you work hard, which means you're probably a slave. Okay, whereas if you're, again, another sign, does your hand have calluses? If it has calluses, that means you work. That means you're a slave. If it's smooth, that means that you're a nobility. You're a higher class. We don't know what the standard was, but there's a reason why the Bible mentions this, because it sets the stage for the next episode, here in verse 7. And it came to pass after these things that his master's wife cast longing eyes on Joseph, and she said, "Lie with me." But he refused and said to his master's wife, "Look, my master does not know what is with me in the house, and he has committed all that he has to my hand. There is no one greater in this house than I, nor has he kept back anything from me but you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" So it was, as she spoke to Joseph day by day, that he did not heed her to lie with her or to be with her. Talk about sexual harassment. Okay, that's what this is. She was essentially pressing him to engage in an affair with her. I mean, lie with me doesn't mean let's take a nap. Okay, it bluntly means have sex with me. That's what that term means. And let's be honest, many teachers, especially of teens and young adults, they try to make Joseph look super spiritual because they're saying, oh yeah, he was 17 at the time. As we're going to see, this is not the case. And people do this because when a male is 17, they're near their sexual peak, and temptations of this type, wow, that's like a young man's dream in many respects. And so they make it, oh yeah, Joseph wouldn't have anything to do with that, even at 17. No, he was probably honestly, he was probably in his late 20s. Yeah, it's still a temptation, but it wasn't so strong and overwhelming. And of course, we see his faith to say no. Why? Well, remember what got him in trouble in the first place with his brothers. He was a man of integrity. They were doing something wrong, and he reported that to his father. He is still a man of integrity. He has a sense of duty and honor toward his master, knowing he could never break the trust that he had with Potiphar, nor would he compromise his knowledge of right and wrong through his faith in God. As far as he was concerned, sorry, lady, you're off limits. Ain't going to happen. And he explained it. And my guess, he explained it multiple times. He made it quite clear because it says day by day by day. Now, a lot of questions crop up to a lot of students here. Why is such a thing happening? I mean, this is a pretty bold woman, basically trying to come on to a slave, and her husband's around. Okay? Well, there's other issues, too, that we have to take into account. In Egypt at this time, according to the law, consensual adultery, which is what Potiphar's wife wanted. She wanted to have an affair with him, and it was not rape. She wanted it. This was punishable by 1,000 blows to the male, okay, with a rod. Okay, so they stand up and they basically beat their back with 1,000 blows, and they mutilate the nose of the woman. Don't quite cut it off, but they definitely take away the beauty of the woman. This is kind of like the Scarlet A, if you ever read the book The Scarlet Letter. It's like a big old red A on your face. Yeah, I tried to commit adultery, or I did commit adultery. So obviously this woman had compelling reason not to risk losing her looks, but yet she still wanted to engage in fun and games with the handsome slave. Why? What was going on? Well, again, we don't know. The Bible doesn't tell us. It's all speculation that comes up. Now, some people, the most common one I hear, and I'll tell you why it probably is not the case, they thought that Potiphar was a eunuch. Okay? Now, a eunuch is an emasculated male. Basically, he's been neutered, shall we say. Okay, like you'd neuter a dog. And therefore, because of this, he was unable to have any relations with his wife. And this was a common practice in some cultures, especially with close counselors, because kings thought that eunuchs were no threat to them. Because once this is done, a lot of the secondary male sex characteristics, such as being aggressive, they were no longer present in a eunuch. Now, as we're going to see, well, actually, in the case of the book of Esther, we find this is not 100% true. Okay, the eunuchs can still plot a coup against the king, but eunuchs, as a rule, were never married, because the whole point of marriage generally was to align politically and to continue on your family. Even if the eunuch was married, and like I said, this is a moot point, but even if the eunuch was married, it was easy for her to, if she was playing around on him, this unfaithfulness was easy to detect, because if she got pregnant, no, they didn't have birth control back then. And no, they didn't have ways of aborting the baby. So as soon as she got pregnant, they knew you've been fooling around, because the eunuch can't do that. That's why a lot of people think he's a eunuch. Most people think no, and here's why. So much for that. Another reason, and this is more, I think, reasonable, was finding and marrying a suitable partner did not always involve love at this time in Egypt. Man did not have to love his wife. He had to provide for her, but if he was content with having a good wife, that would be someone who worked in the house, put food on the table, raised the children. And at that period, this was regarded as a good ancient Egyptian family. But I would say it probably is rather emotionally taxing to the wife if her husband doesn't love her. Now, along these lines, it could be being a busy man. He was the head of the bodyguard. It could be that Potiphar was married to his job. Yeah, I'm married to her, but my job's my priority, so he didn't spend a lot of time at home. Or along the lines of I just said, there was no love present, but maybe he was married to her for political convenience, not because of love. And so he had no interest in her. It's like, yeah, we're married, yeah, we're okay. But yeah, that's the end of it. I mean, and such a marriage, I'm sure, would be very unsatisfying for a wife stuck in this situation. Women were told, your goal in life is to have children. Okay, well, if my husband doesn't want me, oh well, sucks to be you. And that's honestly what the attitude was. There's another thing that also might be lurking in the background. Because Joseph was Potiphar's servant, she might have felt that he was her servant as well. Maybe that we don't know if they had community property laws back then, but it's like, well, actually we do know there's something related to that. So maybe she thought the same thing. Oh, Joseph, he's mine, which meant he had to obey her every whim, no matter how immoral or how illegal. And we don't know. Again, this is all speculation, but perhaps Joseph was not the first boy toy she wanted. Okay? She could have covered up her affairs so that no one could get suspicious. All right? We don't know. I kind of think that, but that's just my opinion. But whatever the case, Potiphar's wife, she's clearly on the prowl, and she had her sights set on Joseph, and he was not going to play her game. And this harassment, day after day after day, and it went on for who knows how long. And he declined her advances every single time. I mean, he made it quite clear to her, my master trusts me with everything in his entire household. No one here has more authority than I do. He has held nothing back from me except you, because you are his wife. How could I do such a wicked thing? It would be a great sin against God. So it's not just because it's bad in the eyes of the culture, it's bad in the eyes of my God. I cannot do this. That's interesting. Nice contrast. Judah fell for and married a Canaanite woman, despite it being the wrong thing to do. Joseph was basically saying no to an adulterous relationship with a pagan woman, and she was his for the asking. If he said yes, life would change. And the foundation of that refusal? His faith in God, which was the root of his integrity and his honor. And even though he was a slave, he still had both. He knew right from wrong and wasn't going to compromise his beliefs in any way. And I imagine this would be a very difficult situation to be in. Here's why. Egypt is a very warm country, pretty much year-round, okay? So people dressed accordingly, all right? Joseph, for example, despite, again, forget what you saw in Sunday schools, forget 10 Commandments. Men generally went shirtless, okay? Wearing a linen kilt or a skirt, shall we say, with a loincloth underneath, because it's just, and it was open enough that you could walk, you could do whatever you need to do. Women wore linen dresses that covered the entire body, but they were very thin. So they're somewhat revealing, okay? And in a case of a woman like this, she wasn't shy, so I would guess that she exposed more of herself than was considered culturally acceptable. But despite Joseph's objections, she was determined to have her way. Okay? And a note on women's fashions. Again, when you see it on the 10 Commandments, the women are actually overdressed. Okay? But hey, they had rules they had to follow in the movie industry, so you don't see it. And thank goodness for that, because I really love that movie, The 10 Commandments. So Potiphar's wife, she had a plan. She was going to get her way one way or the other, and she was soon able to implement this plan. Verse 11. But it happened about this time when Joseph went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house was inside, that she caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand and fled and ran outside. So it was, when she saw that he had left the garment in her hand and fled outside, that she called to the men of her house and spoke to them, saying, "See, he has brought in to us a Hebrew to mock us. He came in to me to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. And it happened when he heard that I lifted my voice and cried out, that he left his garment with me and fled and went outside." This is a setup. I'm sorry. If Joseph decided to play ball, they could have their fun and games and there would be no witnesses because everybody was out of the house. But if he stood firm in his convictions, then she would have her revenge on him by accusing him of attempted rape. And of course, he would deny everything. But who would take the word of a slave over the wife of a high government official? This is a good example of hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. Okay? Now, the Bible does not state outright that she planned the whole thing, but we can infer that this was just not bad luck or coincidence. Take the lack of men in the house, for example. She could have ordered them out of the house on tasks that would be time-consuming, but thus no one would walk in unexpectedly. But they were close enough to hear her scream and come quickly to her rescue. Okay? That might have been the plan. Now, other scholars think that this event may have occurred on a religious holiday in Egypt, where all the servants were basically given a day off and they were down at the temples to worship and make sacrifices and to have a feast. And this was normal for these types of festivals. No one, including her husband, would unexpectedly return to crash her party. And Joseph would not participate because he was a faithful follower of Yahweh, his God. And they were not required, even as a slave, to participate in such activities. And she knew, okay, I've got him. One way or another, I've got him. And so for Joseph, he'd walk in and it's going to be just another day at the job, another day at the office. So he came in, probably expecting nothing more than the usual come-ons from the wife, okay? And he walks right into the trap. Instead of the normal suggestive comments, she gets very aggressive. She grabs him, and I can only say she's trying to rip his clothes off. Sorry, that may sound kind of crass, but no, that's what she was trying to do. And Joseph takes the only right option left open to him. He's out the door. Run away. And he left his kilt behind in her hand. So he was basically only wearing his underwear, his loincloth that was underneath the kilt. All right? So now she's spurned. She's going to have her revenge on this righteous man. She calls out, and some of the other servants arrive at the scene, and she displays the kilt. She displays the garment. She's telling him this is what's happening. She's lying through her teeth. Yeah, Joseph tried to rape me. Isn't it kind of ironic that this is the second time that Joseph had a garment taken from him? And at both those times, they were used as evidence to support a lie. His original robe of many colors. They send it to Jacob. See, he's dead. Here's the robe. It's got blood on it. She's doing the same thing with his kilt. Now, it's not clear if the servants found and held Joseph until the master came home. It really doesn't say. Or if Joseph just stayed out of the house and said, I'm not going back in there. Whatever the case, Potiphar shows up. He comes home for the evening, and the house is very stirred up. Verse 16, so she kept his garment with her until his master came home. Then she spoke to him with words like these, saying, the Hebrew servant whom you brought into us came in to mock me. So it happened as I lifted my voice and cried out that he left his garment with me and fled outside. So it was when his master heard the words which his wife spoke to him, saying, your servant did to me after this manner, that his anger was aroused. Then Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in the prison. Okay, so daddy's home, and now his wife displays the garment and repeats her lie to him. Potiphar gets angry and has Joseph thrown into prison. End of story, right? No. There are a lot of details that are not in the Bible, but a knowledge of history and culture in this area fills in a lot of these gaps. It didn't quite happen that cut and dry. It happened. That was the order of it. But there was a lot more going on here. Now let's look at the statement, Potiphar's anger was aroused. Okay? Who is he mad at? Well, there's a couple of points that a lot of teachers will miss here. First, Potiphar puts Joseph into the king's prison, as was his right. And later on in the chapter, this prison is described as the house of the captain of the guard. Basically, it was right next to his home. Now, would you put a rapist, if someone attempted to rape your wife, would you put him next door? You caught him? No. The penalty for attempted rape against a married woman in Egypt at that time was emasculation. Yeah, we're not going to kill you, but we're going to definitely make sure that you're not going to do this again. Okay? If he actually had raped her, it was the death penalty. Okay? Obviously, neither of these things happened to Joseph. He had children later, and obviously he's not dead. He was placed in a prison that was normally reserved for political prisoners and other high-level offenders, not your run-of-the-mill lockup for rapists. Though I wouldn't call it a resort, prisoners in this type of facility were generally well treated and looked after more respectfully than a normal criminal jail. It was definitely not a deep, dark dungeon, that is so often depicted. Okay? Now, this is an important point because we have to remember that Joseph and Potiphar had a very good working relationship. So good that Potiphar trusted Joseph implicitly with everything. So Joseph trying to rape his wife, this was wildly out of character to anyone who knew Joseph. And I believe Potiphar knew this. It's like, no, you're full of it, lady. This isn't what happened. He may have also been aware of his wife's behavior. Maybe Joseph mentioned it. Your wife's really, I'm feeling very uncomfortable with your wife around because she's saying this. And they said, well, what slave would tell a master that? One who implicitly trusts his master, and one who the master implicitly trusts him. Okay? He might have caught her with trying to seduce other servants. Okay? Other people may have mentioned. We don't know. Okay? And it's interesting how the wife blames Potiphar for bringing Joseph into the house. That Hebrew slave you brought into our house tried to come in and fool around with me. Okay, she's also kind of changing her story a little bit. But it's like, look, this is your fault. It's like, Adam, did you eat the apple? Yeah, the wife you gave me did it, God. And you get it. You gave her to me. It's your fault. And she's doing the same thing. No, it's your fault. You brought this guy in here. And this was an extremely unwise thing to say, since that would have only been true had Joseph been with them a short time and they hadn't gotten to know him. They wouldn't have put someone like that, who they didn't know, with given so much responsibility and power. Now, he'd been with Potiphar for about 11 years. So I think that Potiphar didn't believe his wife, and he was angry with her, not with Joseph. And he had good reason to be mad. I mean, aside from her infidelity. Obviously, there's some monkey business going on, and he sees it. He now had to do something to avoid a scandal, because news of what was happening would probably get around, and regardless of the truth of the matter, if Potiphar didn't do anything, then it would bring shame upon his wife. Now, we know nothing about her background, but if she were of noble birth, which was likely, this would make her whole family look bad. And if there were political implications, it would make Potiphar look bad. I mean, there's similar, we've read, or you can read similar situations, like in the Gospel of Matthew. Joseph finds out, a different Joseph obviously, finds out that his betrothed wife Mary is pregnant with someone else's kid. And so what does he want to do? Well, she should be stoned, but he didn't want to do that. He wants to divorce her quietly and just kind of, in a way, sweep it under the carpet. Okay? Potiphar didn't want to shame his wife, but he had to do something. And so what happens? Well, he gave Joseph as light a sentence as legally possible. No, I'm not going to kill you. No, I'm not going to have you, neutered. You are going to go to prison. A very nice prison. Kind of like Club Fed, as we used to call federal facilities. Okay? So Joseph ends up there because Potiphar couldn't do anything else about the situation, and he had to give up. And Potiphar was probably angry because now he had to give up his most valuable servant. Oh man, we did so much, and now guess what? He's gone. What am I going to do? But it's interesting. Chapter 40 calls the prison the house of the captain of the guard. That was Potiphar. He's identified in this chapter as such. So Joseph was still indirectly under Potiphar's care. And in this way, this was kind of a subtle tribute to Joseph's proven integrity. I'm going to put you where I can still keep an eye on you. You'll be okay. Don't worry about it. And God also vindicated his faithful servant, and he validated his integrity as well. Let's read on, verse 21. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy, and he gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand, all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever they did there, it was his doing. The keeper of the prison did not look into anything that was under Joseph's authority, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made it prosper. I have to wonder if Potiphar recommended to the keeper of the prison, who was his subordinate, that Joseph was an excellent administrator and was a trustworthy man. Because Potiphar didn't want to waste his skills. It's like, no, I can't use him, but hey, he'll help you out in your job in the prison. He's a good guy. Don't worry about him. Because it seems like no time passed at all where this promotion, if you want to call it that, actually took place. And the keeper of the prison never regretted the decision. So we know that God was with Joseph. We keep seeing this over and over again. We also know that God uses different people to bless his own, even if they're not believers. This is a good example of this happen in action. So another question that crops up. Well, what happened to Potiphar's wife then? If he was angry at her, what happened? We don't know. Scripture is very silent on this. We can speculate. I mean, if their marriage was in rough waters before, this whole incident likely shoved it into the rocks. Okay? Really? Oh, yeah. Divorce was a simple procedure in ancient Egypt, and especially in cases of infidelity on the part of the wife. Okay? When one of the spouses leave, it didn't require a court decree or anything. Here's where the community property part comes in. The property is divided. 2/3 goes to the man, 1/3 goes to the woman. And there is no need for a court or any papers, just a simple agreement to part. And here's the weird thing. There was no stigma on divorce and remarrying. Okay? But again, this is all speculation. Don't know this, but this is what, according to the history, how this might pan out. But if looking ahead, I do have to wonder, how did Joseph deal with Potiphar and his wife years later when Joseph was made second ruler in the land by Pharaoh? The Bible doesn't say anything about that either. We'll get to that later. But even though he was in a relatively comfortable place, he was still in prison. That meant he was basically stuck there in the house. He had freedom before. Even as a slave, he could go where he needed to go to conduct business on the part of his master. He actually could represent his master. They had signet seals as well back then. his master would give him the signet. He'd go buy a few cattle or something like that, and that's how they made a signature, was, through a signet. And Joseph probably had access to it. Now he's stuck in a house all the time. Why? Well, God knows. Maybe there was some issue that was coming up that God wanted Joseph to avoid. Maybe God's saying, okay, you've learned your lessons up to this point. You need to learn something else. Maybe he was just trying to build his character and become more prepared for the tasks that were still ahead. Now, the prison would be a school where Joseph would learn patience. Okay? A lot of patience. Since his duties as a prison overseer were less absorbing than those of a chief steward, Joseph had time to think and to pray and to ponder the meaning of the dreams he had had. I'm sure he hadn't forgotten the dreams, and maybe he even had more, but now he's got time in his hands where he didn't have time on his hands before. And maybe God's just trying to teach him a very simple lesson. God's delays are not God's denials. God turned an intended evil against Joseph into a good thing. He was with Joseph. Joseph never had to worry about God. God always had his back. And if you read through, and we're going to continue on, if you read through the entire life of Joseph, it teaches something that's very important. And Joseph himself recognized it. In fact, I'll quote him. He said this in Genesis 50. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good. This is where he learned that lesson, because he was suffering for doing what was right, but God was still blessing him. Now, though still in prison, all was going okay, relatively well. I teach prisoners in the county jail, and I say, have as good a day as you can. Okay, yeah, you're incarcerated. But now his fortunes are about to change. He's about to encounter a man who's going to change his life. So now we move into chapter 40, verse 1. It came to pass after these things that the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their lord and the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief butler and the chief baker. So he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the prison, the place where Joseph was confined. And the captain of the guard charged Joseph with them, and he served them. So they were in custody for a while. Okay? So this tells us there was some malice in the palace, as they say. And that the chief butler and the chief, who was also called the cupbearer, and the chief baker, something happened. They were placed in prison. Now, this wasn't a case that, the baker didn't put enough chocolate chips in his cookies, or that Pharaoh got indigestion after having, a flatbread sandwich. That's not the case here. This was not a good position to be in. There was an investigation going on, and this kind of infers a possible plot to assassinate the Pharaoh. And these two people were the most likely suspects, as their jobs would put them into close contact with the royal person. The cupbearer, for example, extremely important official. His job was to protect the king by making certain that the king's wine and his food was properly served and was safe to eat and drink. He would taste, he would taste the wine, he'd taste the food to make sure it wasn't poisoned. Okay? And because he was pretty much with the king most of the time, he was also a trusted counselor. They knew each other very well. So he would ask questions of, what do you think of this? This is the problem we're having. What do you think we should do? So the cupbearer was a very powerful and influential man. Okay? Now the baker, as his title suggests, he was to prepare baked delicacies for Pharaoh, from whatever desserts they had in that era to just plain old flatbread, which was the normal thing in there. And in that position, he could, if he wanted to, poison the king's food. Now, if he got the cupbearer on his side, they could poison Pharaoh, because it was cupbearer could just say, well, you just eat this one. It doesn't have poison in it. Everything else does. All right? So if he was in collusion, well, guess why? That's why they were both arrested. There was something going on. And God brought these two men into Joseph's life because they could eventually free him and place them in the position that Joseph was being prepared for. Now, how is this going to happen? You got two political prisoners here. What was going to happen? Well, chapter 40, verse 5. Then the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, had a dream, both of them, each man's dream in one night, and each man's dream with their own interpretation. And Joseph came into them in the morning and looked at them and saw that they were sad. So he asked the Pharaoh's officer who were with him in the custody of his lord's house, saying, "Why do you look so sad today?" And they said to him, "We each have had a dream, and there is no interpretation of it." So Joseph said to them, Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell them to me, please." Then the chief butler told his dream to Joseph and said to him, "Behold, in my dream a vine was before me, and in the vine were 3 branches, and it was as though it budded, and its blossoms shot forth, and its clusters brought forth ripe grapes. Then Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, and I pressed them into Pharaoh's cup, and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand." Joseph said to him, "This is the interpretation of it. The 3 branches are 3 days. Now within 3 days Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your place, and you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand according to the former manner when you were his butler. But remember me when it is well with you, and please show kindness to me, and make mention of me to Pharaoh, and get me out of this house. For indeed I was stolen away from the land of the Hebrews, and also I have done nothing here that should put me into the dungeon." Dreams played an important part in the life of leaders in Egypt, and the ability to interpret dreams was a highly sought after and respected skill. Now, so far, as much as we see, Joseph had pondered his own dreams, but this is the first time we are told that he had interpreted the dreams of others. Okay? And we also see a little bit of his personality. The fact that he noticed the sad or dismayed looks on the men's faces showed that he was a caring and discerning man. And the fact that Joseph was in charge of them and yet acted as their servant, and that he gave God the glory, showed that he was now a humble man. Ooh, so far from the mouthy teenager. "Hey, let me tell you about my dream that you're going to hate. And I don't care. You're going to hear it." No more of that. Now let's look at the answer. Lift up your head. This is a phrase that basically here means that your case was considered by the king. All right? That's what it means. He's going to lift your head up so you can look at him in the eye. That's why the thing is there. When you're before the king, you're supposed to have your head down like this. But now he's going to lift your head up so he can look at you. Say, look at me. And apparently, according to the dream, the course of Pharaoh's investigation found the butler innocent of any wrongdoing. So he's going to be restored to his position. Good for him. But then Joseph goes on, and the Bible tells us that there are only 2 instances of Joseph displaying unbelief. That's the only two recorded. This is the first one. Because he knows, because the butler is going to be released, he's going to have access to Pharaoh. And so instead of waiting for God to work, what does Joseph do? He asks him to put a good word for him. Get me out of this place. A man who can interpret dreams, man, Pharaoh would really like having me in his court. He probably didn't say it quite that way, but that was the meaning behind it. What was happening? Joseph was putting his trust in what a man could do instead of depending on what God could do. And it's understandable. He was getting impatient. It's like he's been in this prison for quite a while. We don't know how much yet. He's getting in this prison. It's like, okay, when's it over? Lord, what's going to happen? Maybe this is a way I can shortcut it. No, wait for God's timing. And also it kind of shows that as the years pass, Joseph kind of softened on his brothers a little bit. He didn't mention that his brothers, and he didn't even accuse them of being evil. He only said he was stolen away, which means he was kidnapped from his home. And there's another side to it. That means he was not a slave by choice. He was a free man, and he deserved better treatment. Now, again, this is a subtle and an important point. We kind of mentioned this before. A free man could not be forced to be a slave against his will at this point in Egypt. But if he had a debt, he could willingly become a slave to pay off that debt. And then Joseph described the place as a dungeon. Okay? And as we've seen, it really wasn't. He was confined in a jail for political prisoners. It's called the house of the captain of the guard. It's not a dungeon as we know it. And it might be something along the lines of house arrest. We don't know the details. But as comfortable as it may have been, he was still confined there without cause. And so he was actually speaking somewhat metaphorically. Now, we do the same thing today. I mean, you go to a town like, say, Donut Center and say, this is a real hole. Okay? Is it really a hole? Well, if it's in the middle of a donut, it might be. But, a lot of people will say, well, my favorite is Baker, California. Man, that's the armpit of the desert. Is it an actual armpit? No, it just means that we don't like the place. And they're using metaphorical statements to describe it. So, yeah, even though, this is a nice place to be, this is a dungeon. It might as well be a dungeon. I'm stuck here. Now, this was a very encouraging interpretation for the butler. Wow, I'm going to be freed in 3 days. And the baker apparently thought, ooh, this sounds good too. Do me next. Verse 16. When the chief baker saw that the interpretation was good, he said to Joseph, I was also in my dream, and there were 3 white baskets on my head. In the uppermost baskets were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, and the birds ate them out of the basket on my head. So Joseph answered and said, this is the interpretation of it. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head from you and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat your flesh from you. This wasn't good. Started out great. 3 days, and he even used the same term, well, slightly different. Lift off your head as opposed to lift up your head. Oops. Why is that? Method of execution in Egypt at that time. You were beheaded, and then your body was put up on a stake or a tree, and the whole reason behind that was religious. If you're up there, your soul can't go and rest in the afterlife. It's stuck here. Okay? So essentially, not only are we punishing you in life, we're punishing you in death. And it's clear. Whatever happened, whatever the plot was, even though the butler was innocent, the baker was not. Okay? And so, in a dual sense, the baker's head was also lifted up or off. Okay? Now, Joseph knows this is going to come to pass because he doesn't say, well, in case this doesn't pan out this way, could you talk to Pharaoh? Joseph doesn't ask the baker for a favor, okay, because he knew the baker was doomed. And again, we have to wonder what's going on with the baker when he's hearing this. He probably has this big grin on his face. Oh, that sounds good. What? And maybe he's thinking, wait a minute. Maybe you got the interpretations mixed up. Maybe that's the one for him was supposed to be me, and he's supposed to have mine. Or, he's thinking, well, no, Pharaoh would never kill me. No one can make flatbread like I can. No one can make chocolate chip cookies like I can. It can't be. This can't be. Well, say it all you want. The truth in a prophecy is in its fulfillment, and it is fulfilled. Verse 20. Now it came to pass on the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, that he made a feast for all his servants, and he lifted up the head of the chief butler and of the chief baker among his servants. Then he restored the chief butler to his butlership again, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet the chief butler did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. Joseph made it clear to both of them that God gives the interpretation, and we see he was right on the money. 3 days later, Pharaoh's celebrating his birthday by having a feast. He's restoring his servants back to where they were, especially the innocent ones. The butler's restored. He's back as cupbearer. Baker executed. Okay? Now, Joseph was probably very sorry for what happened with the baker. I know I would be if, I hate to give you this news, but you're a dead man walking now. But it probably encouraged him to see, whoa, those interpretations came true. I actually kind of know what I'm doing. Gee, Lord, thank you. Okay? And so he's thinking, good, it happened. Now, all we need to do is the butler to tell Pharaoh about me. It didn't happen. Chief butler said nothing to Pharaoh because he completely forgot about him. How could someone forget that? Well, I can say probably the Lord made him forget. Again, I think the Lord didn't want Joseph out at that time. So he made the baker forget about it, or the butler forget about it. And kind of there's a lesson there. So much for turning to people for help instead of waiting on the Lord. Okay? I'm wondering, because Psalm 146, I wonder if Psalm 146 was inspired by this story. It starts in verse 3. Do not put your trust in princes, nor in a son of man in whom there is no help. His spirit departs, he returns to his earth. In that very day his plans perish. Happy is he who has the Lord of Jacob, or the God of Jacob, for his help, whose hope is in the Lord his God, who made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, who keeps truth forever, who executes justice for the oppressed, who gives food to the hungry. The Lord gives freedom to the prisoners. Like I said, I wonder if it was inspired by this story. Whatever, Joseph had to wait a couple more years before he was finally called by Pharaoh, and we'll look at that next week. Now, some people say, well, if he had had faith and didn't ask the butler anything, would he have been let out sooner? I don't know. God knows that one. Maybe there again, he wanted Joseph to learn more patience. Okay, the fact he was asking for help to get out kind of says, no, the lessons in patience not done yet. If I failed that test, timing isn't right. Whatever the case, God was ready to unleash Joseph on the Egyptians when Joseph was ready for that task as well. Now, all that we saw today, all that we read in this chapter took place over 13 years, at least 13 years, possibly a little bit more. And during that entire time, and here's the lesson, Joseph stood firm in his faith. 13 years away from home with temptations galore around him. Jacob, at least with Joseph, you taught your lessons well. Because there were many opportunities for Joseph as a young man to go off the rails, especially at first, trapped in a pagan culture that led to too many temptations. Okay? Despite depictions from, again, forget the Ten Commandments and so forth, slaves in Joseph's time were actually fairly well treated. Okay? Acting more as employees as opposed to property. Okay? I mentioned earlier, there's really no stigma in being a slave any more than there was stigma in being a skilled worker. Because the only difference between the two was that the skilled workers got paid. Okay, the slaves did not. But both could move freely with their master's permissions. They could travel for business. They could go anywhere they needed to go. And when they were out and about, even though they were slaves, they were still treated as equals in Egyptian society. Though they were encouraged to participate in the religious rituals of the Egyptians and in their festivals, it was not mandatory. Okay? It would be I would say this would be a stretch to call it a life of ease. But honestly, I think Joseph was better off as a slave in Egypt than he had been living in fear of his life with his brothers. If you think about it, that's pretty much, I think you're right. And certainly the slave quarters at Potiphar's house and even the prison was much more comfortable than sleeping on the ground among the sheep in Canaan. Actually, Joseph had it pretty good. I'm also sure that Potiphar's wife was not the first woman to cast longing eyes on the handsome young Hebrew lad. Though adultery and rape were harshly dealt with, consensual sexual activity before marriage among the unmarried was not. Interesting, because the Egyptians felt that such activity was just a natural part of life. And it usually ended up with the couples getting married anyway, provided the man was able to support a family. And I mentioned this before, part of the reason why this rather lax attitude, why this is here, was because of the philosophy life is short. I already mentioned, average lifespan for an Egyptian at this point in time was 30 years. So people married young, and if a woman got pregnant before she got married, well, this was a sign of, this was a good thing, because a fertile belly was of extreme importance. So slave girls could have tried to work their magic on Joseph, and the culture would have accepted it, and any children produced would have added wealth to Potiphar. But Joseph would abstain with the same conviction he resisted Potiphar's wife. It is a sin against God. Now, considering his eventual position as the chief steward of Potiphar's household, Joseph could expect to be freed at some point, usually through adoption by Potiphar himself as a reward for years of faithful service. And if he wanted to expedite the process, all Joseph had to do was adopt Egyptian religion. And we know that's something he refused to do. So Joseph continued to prosper, not only because the Lord was with him, he was with the Lord. He stood for his religion. He stood for his faith in God, no matter what happened. Okay? Though he may not have understood why he was going through all this, and even though he was probably discouraged from time to time, we kind of see this, he still held firm. And once again, Jacob's teaching to Joseph, as well as the son's determination to remain faithful to those teachings, won the day. And as we're going to see next week, his patience is going to be rewarded. Father, we thank you again for this time we've had together, and we thank you for this lesson on the pluses of standing up for your faith. I know in many ways, as we've kind of read here, today's world is not radically different from the Egypt of that time. Morals are somewhat laxed. Okay? Divorce is easy. Things happened back then, as we read here, that still happen today. But Father, you gave Joseph the foundation through teaching from his father Jacob in the right way to live. And we have that same foundation in your word. We need to realize that you will be with us, but we have to stay with you the whole time. At no point, Father, should we be ashamed of you, because look at what you've done for us. Joseph was never ashamed. He freely spoke his faith, even among pagans. And I think they respected him for us, Father, and for him. And I thank, Father, that we can do the same thing here. And I know, even though we are not the majority church in this region, we are still respected by our neighbors. And that's thanks to you, Father. Thanks to all you've done through us for your kingdom. Father, we just ask you to give us that same courage to stand for our faith, no matter what might be standing in front of us. No matter what threats might be made to our livelihood, we stand up for what is right. And even if it seems like there's injustice taking place, man may be unjust, you are just, and you will pull us through, and you will raise us up and continue to bless us. Father, we thank you again for the time we've had together today, and we ask you to bless our fellowship that follows. Give us traveling mercies as we head on home today. Give us a nice, pleasant Sunday. We praise you, Father. We thank you. We give you all the glory in Jesus' precious name. Amen. Amen.